The stories. This abandoned cabin is a warning trap in winter. The old cabin beside the county line looks empty from the road during storms. Yet a warm porch light appears. Drivers aim for it when whiteout wipes the world because a light means shelter, or at least a neighbor. Rhea Calder is 36 and works as a county snow operations supervisor, and she keeps a spiral notebook of storm anomalies. She shows up before dawn, checks blades and salt loads, and marks complaint calls with a thin blue pen. Her goal this morning is simple: get the ridge plowed before the school runs, then swing by a trouble spot. The spot is a bend near an abandoned mining cabin, where people keep calling for help when the sky goes white. The incident that changes her plan starts with two archived calls that ping the same mile marker and both mention the same porch light. The first caller said the light flicked on like someone waved them in, and then their SUV sank past the axle in drifted powder. The second caller said he saw reflective stakes like a private driveway, and he trusted the stakes and followed them in. Rhea drives out with a plow and a county ranger, and the wind pulls spindrift across the hood like milk. She idles beside the bend, then walks the last stretch on a packed lane that should not exist. The lane is narrow, precisely the width of a small plow, and the snow on its edges shows a scalloped bite that her crews do not leave. She studies the porch light, which is wired to a salvaged marine battery and a hockey puck-sized solar panel. The cabin window is boarded, yet bare footprints cross the porch, and the snow on the mat is tamped smooth with a boot heel. A battery radio inside clicks on and off on weather band, then goes silent like a timer has died. A tow truck appears before Rhea can call the last caller back, and the driver waves from a bright red cab. He introduces himself as Tully Grange, and he says he just happened to be nearby, which is unlikely on a weekday morning before the bus runs. He backs toward the trapped SUV with a practiced arc, then stops when Rhea holds up a hand. "This is county equipment," she says. And he shrugs, then says he can wait in the pullout. She notes the pullout was not there last week, because she passed here in a smaller storm and saw only brush and drift. The fresh gravel under his tires is a tan quartz blend not used by their supplier, which her crews call peach pit gravel because it stains gloves. Complication lands in small details that refuse to match, and details are the only honest witnesses in bad weather. The reflective stakes near the porch are county colors, yet the plastic sleeves are slightly glossy, which means hardware store knockoffs. The stake spacing mirrors a county driveway template, yet the end flare is reversed, which a training manual would not allow. She opens her spiral and writes the count of stakes and the order of colors, then photographs each with her phone. The ranger sets a trail camera on a fence post, angled at the bend, and another on the porch beam, both tagged with the hour and coordinates. Rhea pulls a corner of the mat and finds two zip ties and a clipped wire, both wet from this morning, not last week. Investigation moves step by step when the storm pauses and the phones ring less, so she visits a gas station near the turnoff. The clerk says a red tow truck fills up on calm days and buys coffee for anyone who mentions the cabin. A retired school bus driver named Lauren Ibarra stops for a paper, and he says he saw private plow tracks peel off before the storm, then vanish in wind. She requests dispatch logs for the past 3 winters and filters for that mile marker, then highlights clusters that pair with heavy snow. Callers mention the same porch light, the same reflective stakes, and the same quick tow arrival, which dispatch marks as helpful. She watches a dash cam clip from last month where the light clicks on as the hood swings left, then the video ends with a soft crunch. Archived calls from 2021 mention a ham radio voice that says shelter is nearby, and then silence like a squelch cut. A volunteer firefighter says in a witness statement that the cabin used to be a safety cache and now nobody claims ownership. A Forest Service mail thread she prints at the office says the cabin fell off the map after a boundary change in 2019. Rhea returns with 2 crew trucks and a trooper who knows every rancher along that ridge, and they wait for nightfall. A thin moon slides behind blown cloud, and the porch light pops alive at the first gust, soft and steady like a welcome sign. A compact pickup rolls up from the far side with its lights off, then a figure hops out and crouches at the porch corner. The ranger whispers that the figure holds a small remote, and the light changes from dim to bright after a thumb tap. Rhea steps forward and says, "Good evening," and the figure bolts toward the pickup, then slips where the packed lane meets churned gravel. The trooper covers the exit with his lights, and the pickup idles in a pool of steam, and the figure surrenders with hands up. They identify him as a subcontractor to Grange Recovery, and his jacket pockets hold a keychain remote and 2 spare batteries. Zip ties match the ones under the mat, and a roll of reflective tape matches the stakes, which are cut to driveway template lengths. He says he was only maintaining a safety light and keeping the lane open, which is not a service the county requested. Rhea stays methodical because motive hides under habit, not speeches that arrive too fast. She asks where the gravel came from, and he says a supplier in the valley, yet the receipts in his glove box show a hardware warehouse 2 counties south. She asks why the radio trips a loop on weatherband after the door opens, and he says it helps people feel calm. She compiles a timeline that starts with a bridge closure 3 winters ago, which pushed navigation apps toward this county road. Drivers used the cabin light as a wayfinder during whiteouts, while their maps insisted the bend belonged to a safe connector. The subcontractor and a partner groomed a false lane with a small plow, then dragged a lure line past the porch to a drift. Vehicles followed the stakes and the shine, then sank where the wind always filled the cut, and then a tow contract appeared fast. The subcontractor had a scanner tuned for dispatch, and he shadowed snow squalls, then nudged the light when a hood turned. The porch light served as both promise and bait, a warning tone that pretended to help while herding people toward trouble. The twist clicks when Rhea notices something everyone else ignored, because details are stubborn and patient when money moves. The stakes used county colors, yet the white stripe appears cream at dusk, which happens when old tape yellows in cold. The county only switched to that tape after a backorder last spring, yet the stakes showed last winter, which means someone copied and refreshed. She pulls a photo from the first cluster of calls and zooms on a stake that leans at a slant near a spruce. A boot print sits at the base with a split heel pattern, and the subcontractor wears the same make, which the trooper confirms. The peach pit gravel under the pullout matches bags stacked in the pickup bed, stamped with a store brand not used locally. They bring in Tully Grange on a quiet afternoon, and he arrives calm, carrying a thermos with a sticker from a drag racing track. He says he never told anyone to follow that light, and he is right in the narrow way salesmen are right. He made sure the light stayed visible from the highway, and he made sure the false lane looked exactly like a private driveway. Rhea uses her spiral notes and dispatch timestamps and the dashcam clip to assemble a proof that a prosecutor can lift. The proof is plain. The lane grooming aligns with tow arrivals, and the light remote explains the synchronized porch glow. The radio loop satisfies a claim of safety service, yet the loop trips only when a door opens after a driver commits. Witnesses give short statements. A school custodian says he saw stakes in a truck behind the parts store, and a rancher remembers a trailer loaded with gravel. A hardware buyer confirms past orders of reflective sleeves and tape and county patterns, then prints invoices with dates that match storm weeks. The trail camera video shows the subcontractor stepping off distances with a tape measure, then pressing reflectors into drifted banks. The county files charges on false markings and a long list of fraud-related counts, and the state adds a charge tied to interference. Rhea builds a corrective plan with simple steps: remove the stakes, angle the porch light away from the bend, and post clear closure boards. She requests new advance signs that warn of no outlet during storms, and the road team builds a berm past the bend. In spring, she visits the cabin in daylight when the stream runs high and the spruce throws a clean shadow. The boards are still up, and the marine battery sits in a crate with a tag that says evidence in blocky marker. She writes a last page in the spiral: cabin neutralized, tow arrivals normal, and local drivers back to watching the sky instead of a lure. She keeps the dashcam clip on her work desktop as a reminder of how easily stressed people choose the first light they see. She writes a line on a training slide: never chase glow in a whiteout, choose distance markers and windbreaks and patience. She speaks at a town meeting using plain words, then thanks the bus drivers and the ranch hands who notice small things that save bigger things. According to a statement filed later, the subcontractor said he borrowed the idea from a forum where recovery outfits shared winter tips. The forum is archived now, and the thread title mentions hazard magnets, which makes her jaw tighten in a quiet office. She forwards the archive to a state liaison, then shuts her laptop and listens to the heater tick inside the shop. 2 winters later, a driver who once followed the light sends the department a short letter with a photo of the bend in Sunday. The letter says, "Thank you for fixing the trap, and thank you for posting signs that speak like a human, not a brochure." Rhea pins the photo on the bulletin board and draws a small check beside the mile marker on a laminated map. The cabin still stands, where the wind stacks powder against the wall and a jay hops along the porch rail after a thaw. People talk about that porch like a lucky star in a bad stretch. Yet the real luck was a person with a notebook. A false beacon is a cruel thing in winter, and the fix was not a heroic beatdown, only careful eyes and a stop. She drives past when each first snow begins, then checks the berm and the markers and the culvert past the spruce. The road hums under studded tires, and the bend looks like any other bend in a county full of the same bends. She knows a trap can wear a smile and a soft bulb, and a warning means nothing unless it points away from harm. The old cabin still looks empty if you do not look close, and light can lie when money needs help. Rhea prefers the dull honesty of a reflector that never blinks, and a berm that refuses to pretend it is a road. She closes her spiral at the end of each shift and treats winter like a puzzle that pays back the patient mind. The stories. Paramedic who returned a ring to the ranger station. He found the ring beneath a bench outside the ranger station after a thunderstorm cleared and left everything smelling like pennies. The inscription was shallow from wear, yet legible enough to stop him cold before he tossed it in Lost and Found. His name was Daryl Keene, 32, paramedic on the rural night unit that parked near the station between calls. He had clocked out late and planned to drive home for eggs and sleep, nothing heavier than traffic and weather. The ring was small, silver, scuffed, with 4 letters etched inside that did not match any brand he recognized. He wiped it on his shirt, felt ridiculous superstition prickle his neck, then reminded himself that metal was just metal. He walked into the station lobby where the maps curled at the edges and flyers begged hikers to sign trail registers. The clerk on duty that morning was a seasonal hire named Isabel Rusk, 26, wildlife biology graduate and coffee loyalist. She wrote the ring in the inventory ledger, asked his phone number for a courtesy call, and slid it into a tray. Dario left a note by instinct, a paramedic habit, logging time and location and weather in case someone asked later. Out in the parking lot, he replayed last night, which featured a stranded camper with mild hypothermia and a false alarm. He could not shake the ring, which was strange, because he usually forgot objects once they were filed and numbered. On his day off, he cut through town for groceries and noticed a poster at the laundromat that mentioned a missing ring. The page was sun-warped and stapled crooked, with a photocopied hand and the same 4 letters circled in black pen. The contact tear slip was gone, but a name remained that matched an old Ranger call sign he knew from dispatch. He remembered hearing it during training, tucked into an anecdote about a search several winters before he joined the unit. Back at his apartment, he opened a plastic tote where he kept spiral notebooks filled with patient notes and road observations. He used them to steady his head when night shifts stacked up and details blurred into one long siren-haunted ribbon. He flipped through a winter notebook and found an entry about a storm closure at the North Ridge trailhead near mile marker. There was a scribble about a reported vehicle in the lot after midnight, and a reference to archived calls marked cold case. The 4 letters matched the poster and the notebook, and his stomach tightened like he had stepped into empty air unexpectedly. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he looked again at the handwriting and knew he would not sleep without checking. He drove to the station and asked for Isabel, who had just come off trail crew support and smelled faintly like pine cleaner. She retrieved the tray, confirmed the ledger entry, and admitted that the ring already drew a call from a withheld number. The caller reportedly asked whether the inscription was intact, then hung up when she offered the standard lost property procedure. Isabel shrugged and said weird things find the station every year, then asked why he looked like he had swallowed a tack. Dario explained the poster and his notes, careful with phrasing, avoiding names and exact dates that might tag private people. He asked whether the old Ranger call sign meant anything to her, and she frowned like a person trying to remember a ringtone. She typed on a terminal that still beeped like an old cash register and pulled up a thin incident summary from past seasons. The report mentioned a volunteer ranger named Lyle Witt, mid-40s, seen last signing out to check a flooded culvert. Witness statements suggested he turned off the main road to assist a motorist in a heavy rain that erased tire tracks. Final footage from a highway maintenance camera showed headlights near the ridge turnout, then heavy static as wind battered the lens. The four letters in the ring inscription matched his initials and a nickname the volunteer used on old trail day signboards. The summary ended with a note that the vehicle and the volunteer were not recovered despite grid searches and river scans. Dariel felt the room narrow, which happened to him on difficult scenes when he needed to pick the next useful action. He asked whether they ever collected personal property from that area, and Isabel said most recovered items turned up much later. She added that spring melt exposes things that winter hides, and lost metal often travels far in culverts and channels. Dariel asked to sign a witness statement, which felt strange, since his only act had been bending for a glint under a bench. He described the find with plain details, like distance from the threshold and position of the bench slats and water stains. He included the weather and the timestamp from his phone, then he photographed the ledger page with permission for his records. On his way out, he noticed a corkboard with dryer lint textures of flyers, including one about historic flood years and culvert maintenance. A little printed square described a storm nearly 20 years back that undercut the ridge road and formed a temporary sinkhole. The line about road repairs matched a rumor he had heard on overnight radio, the sort of thing callers debate between traffic updates. He took a photo of the square and wrote down the maintenance contact number, then drove home feeling like the ground rode along. That evening, he called the maintenance office and reached a supervisor named Raleigh Dim, 51, veteran of patchwork and paperwork. Raleigh remembered the volunteer by call sign and said the guy reportedly once welded a broken gate hinge on his lunch hour. He explained that the ridge turnout drained into a service culvert that emptied into an old arroyo behind a shuttered campground. He added that a private tow company once pulled an abandoned sedan from a side basin during late summer, then misplaced the paperwork. Dariel asked whether the county kept disposal receipts, and Raleigh said archived bills lived in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil. He offered to meet the next morning with access to the paper stacks if Dariel did not mind dust and swearing at faded ink. They met in a low building whose metal roof pinged when gulls landed, and Raleigh rolled out a ladder and a cart with binders. Dariel paged through invoices and found a line item for a recovered vehicle from the ridge vicinity after a storm year. The receipt lacked a plate number, which set his teeth on edge, but it listed a description that matched the volunteer's truck. A handwritten note in the margin directed the tow company to hold personal effects for a claim that never arrived or cleared. Dariel used his phone to scan the page, then asked Raleigh whether the side basin ever got dredged for heavy debris after storms. Raleigh nodded and said they tried, but the basin had pockets where things settled deep and stayed quiet until a new season. Back at the station, Isabel took the scanned receipt and added it to a folder that had begun to resemble a small case file. She called the number from the old poster just in case, and it rang to a voicemail that no longer accepted messages. They agreed not to speculate out loud, which is how responsible people hold a line between curiosity and harm to private families. Instead, they requested access to dispatch logs from that storm week, using internal email channels and precise language about inventory continuity. The logs showed multiple calls reporting a stalled vehicle and disappearing taillights near the ridge turnout around the same time. One archived call captured a voice asking if the station had a spare chain, then cutting out as thunder rolled over everything. Dariel listened and felt a human scale of time, the way a minute expands when weather takes over and simple plans collapse. He thought about why the ring would end up under the bench unless someone placed it, then pictured stormwater spreading like a net. Isabel checked the station exterior and found a grill over a drain that emptied near the bench after long downhill runs. She traced the channel on the maintenance map and saw a path from the arroyo through a culvert that cut beneath the parking lot. It sounded improbable at first, then they considered how small objects ride water differently than larger debris during heavy flow. A ring could slip past grates like a coin tossed to luck, then settle where turbulence died and janitors swept after hours. They walked the route during daylight and marked scuff lines from past flows, following pebbles like breadcrumbs to the station edge. At a low grate, they found a snag of twigs and a strip of cloth that might be from a work shirt pocket. Isabel bagged the cloth and labeled it for possible testing, though neither expected much, and both respected quiet possibilities. They logged locations and took photos from eye level and boot level, then stored everything in the folder that felt heavier daily. That night, a withheld number called the station again and left a message that asked whether the initials were still visible. The voice sounded older and careful, and the caller reportedly asked about stainless versus silver, then thanked someone who had not answered. Daryl suspected a relative who wanted privacy, so he did not push for a callback through caller lookup that might bruise boundaries. Instead, he asked Isabel to post a simple notice that an item was found, with identification proof required and no description. 3 days later, a woman arrived with wind-bitten cheeks and an envelope of photocopies of Trail Day signboards and old photos. She introduced herself as Marnie Witt, 50, postal clerk, and said she believed the ring belonged to someone she once knew. She produced a photocopy of a volunteer roster with initial marks that matched the inscription style and the spacing between letters. She also brought a scanned image of a birthday photo reportedly taken at the station picnic where the ring first appeared on a hand. Isabel followed procedure, asked neutral questions, and requested a description without revealing any difference between steel and silver. Marnie said it was silver and scuffed from manual work, and the letters were done with a cheap engraving pen from a hardware counter. She had no interest in press or drama, only closure regarding a box of things that never found a rightful shelf at home. She did not ask about remains or rumors, and the room felt like a church hallway, with voices quietly minding the floor echo. Daryl watched her study the ring like a person watching weather, accepting change without bargaining. Then she nodded and held it close. She signed the claim form and thanked them for record keeping, then said she planned to take the ring to a quiet spot and breathe. After she left, Daryl and Isabel sat silently with a folder that could be closed even without answers that win headlines. They updated the file with non-identifying language, noting that the event remained unresolved, but an item found its probable keeper. A week later, Raleigh called to say the warehouse yielded another stack of toe slips that linked the earlier receipt to a dated work order. The order referenced a truck pulled from a side basin near the arroyo, with no occupant listed and disposal recorded after waiting periods. Daryl printed the work order and attached it to the file, then suggested a courtesy memo to the county records office for alignment. The memo included excerpts from dispatch logs, witness statements, and the inventory ledger, written plainly, without speculation or sharp claims. He drove to the turnout that evening and parked where the wind rolled downhill like a waterless river over dry grass. He stood by the newly repaired grate and imagined a ring skipping through stormwater, then settling under a bench as the world dried. On the way back, he stopped at the laundromat and saw the old poster had been removed, the staple holes still marking the cork. He felt relief, and something else that did not have a tidy name, a feeling like finishing a call without losing anyone. At the station, Isabel had taped a small note above the lost and found that read, "Inventory matters, please describe details patiently." Daryl smiled because he knew how patience saved lives on ugly roads, and how tiny facts often carried heavy conclusions silently. He wrote a final entry in his notebook that summarized the chain of events, using timestamps and neutral phrasing like a field report. He listed his own doubts and how they changed, which he did after tough nights, so future him remembered the shape of useful doubt. He drove home and fried eggs and left the radio off, letting the quiet fill in around the edges of the long day. In the morning, he returned to duty and checked his ambulance kit twice, then a third time, because routine confidence keeps hands steady. News never broke big from the ridge, and that felt right. Because families deserve weathered truths without strangers guessing for sport. The station kept the folder in a locked cabinet with a slip that directed any future inquiry to records with gentle formality. When Daryl parked near the bench again, he looked at the drain and thanked the design that nudged a small thing into daylight. He also thanked the habit of writing things down, because memory can bend when nights are long and calls stack like restless waves. He knew the ring did not fix the story, yet it tightened the edges enough to hold, like stitching on a torn sleeve. He decided that returning it mattered regardless of headlines, because care can look like a metal circle resting in a palm. Later, a storm rolled across the hills and the station roof hammered, but the grate held and the lot drained without drama. Daryl watched the water pass the bench and felt steadier than the week before, which is a kind of quiet rescue in itself. He thought about that last highway camera clip that cut out as wind rose, and he hoped the driver knew someone kept looking. He believed that simple custody of small objects carried weight, and he promised himself to keep taking notes when the world blurred. The next week, a handwritten thank you arrived with no return address, just a single sentence about holding grief like a stone. Isabel logged the letter, then placed it in the file where it settled beside receipts and call logs and dry photographs. They closed the cabinet gently, like leaving a campsite clean, and the station returned to business with maps and radios humming. Daryl stepped outside, breathed air that smelled like wet bark, and felt awake enough to meet the next ordinary emergency. He walked past the bench and saw nothing shine, and that unremarkable view felt right, like a road that finally held its line. The stories. Church basement inventory revealed alleged proof of entry. The basement smelled like wet cardboard after last week's rain, and the fluorescent lights flickered with that jittery, tired kind of buzz. The line that mattered on the clipboard looked boring at first, but it carried a small number that should have been bigger. Her name was Nora LeClaire, age 34, community center custodian and part-time bookkeeper for the small church pantry. She had the Tuesday shift, which mostly meant moving pallets, counting cans, and scrubbing the concrete where the sump spat out rusty water. She wanted to finish early, pick up a thrifted lamp for her apartment, and call her sister about a family thing. The incident began when she saw the dented case of condensed soup sitting on the wrong pallet, with a slip stapled crooked. A volunteer wrote a note saying damaged during last drop, which did not match the neat handwriting she recognized from Sunday. The sump had overflowed during the storm, and the security cameras upstairs reportedly lost power around the same time. She checked the ledger, found last month's count for the soup, and tapped the line with a capped marker before reading twice. The numbers disagreed by 8 units, and the shrinkage column did not carry any explanation or initials. That should have thrown her for a minute, but a volunteer named Lyle had logged minor adjustments before, then forgotten to sign. She walked the aisles between pallets, past the bin of torn paperbacks, and the rack of winter coats that smelled like cedar chips. A faint drag mark curved through the thin crust of silt left by the flood, wide enough for a small hand truck wheel. It started by the loading door, then slipped behind the pantry shelves where the camera never had a sightline. Nora took photos on a battered phone, making sure the timestamp showed the date, then set the clipboard on a milk crate. She drew a simple diagram in her notebook, noting each pallet corner, then circled an area where floor paint looked scuffed. She counted the soup again, slowly, touching each can and speaking the numbers under her breath. 8 missing, she said, and it landed with more weight than she expected. She did not like accusing anyone, and the pantry had a habit of losing track during rush weeks. Still, the door to the loading ramp had fresh scrapes near the latch, and the volunteer key box upstairs had been sticky since the humidity climbed. The complication widened when she checked the box of hygiene kits and found a weird mix of travel bottles and 3 missing toothbrush packs. Those packs were counted by weight on a cheap scale, and the number on the sticky label did not match the ledger. The printer upstairs had jammed on Sunday, which meant someone finished the label by hand and skipped the second signature. A neighbor named Pete, age 57, retired mechanic, leaned down the stairwell and called everything steady down there. He helped with deliveries since his shop closed, and he kept spare bungee cords in his truck like trophies. She told him about the numbers, and he shrugged while scratching his jaw with a knuckle. Probably rain week jitters, he said. Then he looked at the drag mark and stopped talking for a beat. The mark led under a folding table, then faded near the coats. He pointed at the wall and said, "That outlet tripped last night. I reset it around 6. Nora asked who else came in yesterday, and Pete listed 2 volunteers by first names, then mentioned a teenager who picked up old pew cushions. She noted every name, added question marks where needed, then walked the perimeter slowly with her phone light near the baseboards. A glint showed beneath a stacking chair, so she nudged it aside and found a broken zip tie. The tie was the same size used for coat rack tags, but also the same size used on the loading door latch. She set it on the milk crate, then checked the thermostat in the storage room because the compressor sounded odd. The thermostat was set to a colder number than usual, and someone had switched the fan to constant instead of auto. She checked archived calls on the office phone, each scribbled on a pad by the reception desk, and saw a message about a refrigeration tech. The date on that message matched the storm, and the next line said, "Service postponed due to flooded bridge," which made sense. The fridge down in the basement had been stubborn for weeks, and everyone had opinions about it. The investigation took shape slowly, with tight steps that felt small until they did not. She photographed the drag, the zip tie, and each shelf with missing soup. She called the non-emergency number listed on the bulletin board, then explained she was not reporting a crime, only logging irregularities. The dispatcher told her to keep notes and offered a reference number she wrote at the top of the page. She interviewed a woman named Karina, age 42, school cafeteria worker, who came for a bag of pantry staples before her evening shift. Karina said she saw a man at the ramp door on Monday wearing a baseball cap that hid most of his face. He held a coat on one arm, and he carried a reusable bag with a grocery logo. He left quickly when a choir member came through with sheet music and coffee. Nora thanked her, wrote down the details, then asked Pete if a delivery truck had come without posting in the group chat. He said no trucks except the dairy driver, who dropped crates outside after the storm. He showed his phone, scrolling through photos of the ramp, and pointed to a picture from early morning that showed the door closed with a new scratch near the bottom hinge. She opened the binder of fire inspection reports, looking for any change that registered during the outage. The inspection from 2 months ago said the exit alarm was functioning, and the last weekly test had initials from Lyle again. She went to the exit door alarm, pressed test, and watched the light flash, but heard no chirp. The battery had been pulled slightly, not fully removed, just eased out enough to break contact. She took a picture with the battery number visible, then slid it back in and heard the chirp, which made her flinch. Pete raised his eyebrows and said, "That is not wind," which sounded like a joke until he saw her keep writing. She checked a box of donation forms under the big table, where volunteers slipped notes when drop-offs came after hours. One envelope had muddy smears on the edge, and the handwriting said coats only with an underline that went too far. Inside sat a receipt from a thrift store with a timestamp from late Sunday and a note that said leave by ramp door because of stairs. Nora called the thrift store, asked a clerk if a man in a cap had bought bulk coats, and waited while the clerk checked. The clerk said yes. A tall man with a limp bought 9 coats and paid cash, then took the bus toward the river stop. Nora wrote that quickly, added the time, and drew a tiny bus icon without thinking. She opened the old laptop in the office and loaded the final footage saved before the outage, which barely showed the stair-top landing. A shadow crossed the landing on Monday evening at dusk, carrying something bulky, then returned minutes later with faster steps. The camera angle could not catch a face. Only the cap brim and the arm load, which looked like quilt batting or a heavy sleeping bag. She thought about the soup, the hygiene packs, and the coats, then thought about the drag mark that ended near the rack. The rack had a hidden caster that always swiveled wrong, which left that same half-moon scrape when pushed sideways. She crouched and touched the caster, finding a smear of silt that did not match dust from raised corners. The twist snapped into view when she turned the soup case and saw a tiny sticker tucked behind the manufacturer's label, handwritten in blue ink. The sticker said Tuesday return hold with initials that were not Lyle's, which matched a habit from a former volunteer named Mateo. He left months ago after a family problem, but he signed returns with looping letters that everyone teased. Mateo's sister had asked for help in winter, and someone recalled she lived near the river park in a tent for a month. Witness statements from that season mentioned a man with a limp who avoided the main entrance because of pride. The archived calls showed a message from a restricted number on Monday evening, which said, "Ramp door buzzer broken, we'll circle back at dusk." Nora realized the inventory miscount for soup matched exactly the number of coats purchased at the thrift store on Sunday. 8 missing cans, 9 coats reported, and 3 toothbrush packs absent from the hygiene bin. She checked the program binder that tracked special requests, which listed a short note from 2 weeks ago about a family living in a truck with limited storage. Soup was labeled easy to heat, coats were labeled heavy but foldable, and toothbrushes were labeled priority for school-age kids. She looked at the ramp door again and saw a second set of scrapes, higher up, where a crutch might have knocked paint from the frame. She remembered Mateo broke his ankle years back, and the limp never fully left. Pete cleared his throat and said, "You think this is not a break-in, right?" Nora kept her voice steady, then said, "It looks like someone who knew the layout, who made sure the alarm stayed quiet, and who avoided asking directly because of shame." He rubbed his jaw, then nodded slowly as he watched her take a photo of the scraped paint. They called the non-emergency line again, and she read her notes while the dispatcher typed. The dispatcher said an officer could make an informational visit tomorrow and advised them to secure the door and replace the tie. She logged the reference number, stapled the list of missing items to the daysheet, then wrote a clear statement about suspected entry without damage for records only. She left a message for the pantry coordinator, age 51, paraeducator, explaining the situation with careful words about the storm and the power hiccup. She suggested moving the coat rack upstairs during inventory days and adding a second sign-off when labels were handwritten. She also suggested leaving a clear path for people who struggled with stairs, which sounded like a tiny policy shift hidden inside a counting problem. An hour later, a choir member named Lorna stopped by for her binder, and Nora asked if she had seen anyone at the ramp on Monday. Lorna said a man waited near the dumpster just before the thunder started again, holding a bag and looking anxious. She brought him into the vestibule briefly, offered water, and pointed him toward the office for assistance, but he left before she finished tuning the piano. Nora thanked her, logged the time, then matched it with the shadow on the final footage that crossed the landing at dusk. The puzzle fit without heroics, and the proof sat in quiet things like stickers and scratches and silt. The pantry had not been ransacked, only visited by someone who treated the space like an old workplace where he still belonged a little. She printed a fresh sign for the ramp that said "Ring bell twice for assistance," then taped it high where bus riders would see it. She taped another sign next to the loading latch that reminded volunteers to check the exit alarm light before locking. Pete found a spare battery for the alarm in a drawer and switched it while whistling a few off-key notes. Before leaving, she took one last slow walk with the clipboard, checking counts, finding that the numbers now made a practical sort of sense. The soup miscount lined up with the return sticker, the drag mark matched the broken caster, and the exit alarm explained the quiet door. The proof of entry was not dramatic, yet it was enough to tell a story that accounted for every small change. The next afternoon, the coordinator called back after speaking with a patrol officer who agreed to mark the report as information only. The officer reportedly checked dispatch logs from the storm night and confirmed multiple power blips across the block, which could explain the camera outage without conspiracy. The coordinator also reached Mateo through a community contact, who acknowledged taking coats and supplies, then offered to meet with her to return the soup or sign for it officially. Nora sat at the folding table and wrote a short summary for the pantry records, keeping it plain and careful and believable. She described the season's pressure, the storm, the small mistakes, and the way people try to preserve dignity when they are worn thin. She ended with a simple line about counting what matters and leaving a light where it can be found. She locked the loading door with a fresh tie, turned the thermostat back to normal, and unplugged the stubborn fridge for a counted 10 before restarting. The compressor settled into a softer hum that made the space feel less anxious, and the fluorescent lights kept their flicker but seemed less harsh than earlier. She put the clipboard away, then washed the silt from her hands until the water ran clear. On her way up the steps, she looked back at the neat rows of cans and the rack of coats that hung like quiet witnesses. The basement did not feel like a crime scene. It felt like a place that absorbed hard weather and kept doing its small work. The inventory told the story the way ledgers often do, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and specific enough to be true. Pete waited by the door and asked if she still wanted to find that lamp after her shift, and she smiled and said yes. He held the door as they stepped into the thin sunshine that follows a week of rain, where water still shone in shallow puddles. She made a mental note to buy a pack of batteries and write bigger labels, then walked toward the sidewalk with an easier stride. Later that week, the coordinator posted a message thanking the volunteers for patience and reminding everyone to sign twice when handwriting labels. The note also said the ramp bell worked again and that the basement alarm had a new battery with a date written in marker. A final line invited anyone needing help to knock during open hours and to leave a note if mobility made the stairs hard. Nora kept the broken zip tie in a drawer with a handful of odd things that never quite fit anywhere. She wrote the date on a card and tucked it with the tie as a simple reminder that proof can be small and stubborn. The basement went back to smelling like cardboard instead of worry, and the flicker of the lights felt ordinary again. She told her sister about the lamp and then about the inventory, and they both laughed quietly at how much a can of soup can reveal. The town kept moving around them in a slow, practical rhythm that ignored weather until it had to pay attention. The story rested inside a file folder without drama, but with enough careful detail to be respectfully believed. The stories. Dispatcher, who kept the secret from a bridge call, the call began with the sound that never leaves him, a river hush that sat under a thin voice. On the log, it read as a welfare check near the west span. The timestamp matched the shift change. The tower camera sent a smeared view of headlights, and the wind pushed rain and slanted ropes across steel. He wrote the first line in block letters. Male caller. Alone. No traffic lane blocked. Unknown age. Unknown intent. In training, they, from the start, had said the first 10 seconds decide the rest. He believed that for years. He had a plain goal that night. Finish paperwork early, drink the cold coffee anyway, and get home before midnight. Kellen Duarte, age 38, worked as an emergency dispatcher in a river town that never liked headlines. He lived quiet. 2 rooms over a grocery where the owner knew his name and saved him bruised peaches. He was good at the slow voice and the clear questions. He kept a notebook with dates and little arrows. On the tape, his opening line sounded the same as always. County Communications, tell me what is happening. The caller coughed, then said he was at the railing near the center truss. He asked for no sirens. Kellen clicked a marker on the map and moved the cursor a hair so the unit tags would not overlap. He asked for a name, and the caller hesitated like he was picking one from a shelf he had not visited. Call me Ross, the man said, then added something about the water looking like foil if you did not blink. There was a push of air like a mic against a jacket, and the traffic under the bridge hummed steady. Kellen kept the tone even, told Ross that people could meet him where he stood, and asked what brought him there. Someone I loved died on this bridge, Ross said. And his voice steadied, like he had waited to finally say it. In his log, Kellen wrote the words that mattered. Loss stated. Prior connection to scene. No weapons reported. Calm speech. From the other console, Nira scrolled road closures and passed him a sticky note that read, Northbound lane is clear. He muted the room feed for a second so the printer squeal would not land in Ross's ear and spook him. He asked the year of the loss, and Ross said it fast, like it tasted bad. 2014. Kellen repeated the year and let the silence work while he dispatched a patrol car and a medic unit in the background. He knew the story people told about that year. A sedan climbed the curb during a storm and hit a contractor. The papers had run one photo of cones and a dropped hard hat. No names followed, just an archived blurb and rain. From the tower camera, a freight train horn carried along the riverbank, then faded as the unit names flashed en route. Kellen asked if Ross knew the person who died by name. Ross said he knew the face and the last words. A small thing changed in Kellen then. A sound from the record shelf in his mind fell flat and stayed there. He once took a midnight call from a work crew foreman near the same span. He kept that tape in memory. Ross said the last words were not for him. They were for a dispatcher who told the crew to hold 10 minutes. Kellen tapped the headset cushion, careful to keep the room quiet, and asked where Ross had heard those words. Ross said he had heard them from a phone found in a cracked case under the North Pier after the storm. He said the phone worked for one day after the rain stopped, and that he had played the last message recorded. He said the message was from County Communications with a different voice, and it told the crew to stay clear. Kellen felt the old shift wash through him. The storm year had ended in a tangle of rumors and a closed memo. He had read that memo while filing tired overtime sheets. He filed it without speaking and chose to keep moving. On the camera, one pair of headlights slowed near the shoulder as if a driver could sense the weight of the rail. Kellen radioed the nearest cruiser to stage 2 blocks off with lights off, and he asked Nira to notify the medic quietly. He asked Ross to tell him who the contractor was, and Ross said the name with a short stop between first and last. The name matched the contractor mentioned in the closed memo, except the memo had spelled the name without an accent mark. Kellen wrote the name as Ross said it, exact and careful, then underlined it once for the transcription that would follow. He asked Ross why he came now and not earlier, and Ross said an anniversary sits on the mind like a stone. He also said that the memo never named the dispatcher who told the crew to hold, which was why he had called. Kellen understood the shape of that ask, even if the words around it were soft. He was not supposed to name staff. The policy existed for safety and sanity, and it covered nights when grief needs a door and someone tries that door. He told Ross he could share what the record allows, and he asked if hearing the process might help him stand. Ross said hearing the process might help, though he refused the idea of sirens again and asked for plain truth instead. Kellen kept his sentence length slow and warm. He said that storm calls can trigger staggered staging for worker safety. He said if there were downed lines or compromised joints, a hold might be given while a state engineer was patched in. He also said that every such hold carried timestamps, and that those stamps were kept by policy for 7 years. Ross breathed in and asked what happens when 7 years have passed, and Kellen answered before he could think of softness. He said the system cycles recordings to deep archives after 7 years, and some are erased when retention windows expire. Ross said he had a copy in case the archive could not confirm. Then he claimed the voice on the tape named a company. He said the tape used a phrase that a dispatcher would not use unless someone off-channel asked for a careful delay. Kellen had heard that phrase once. It was the night a junior engineer requested a slow approach while a supervisor closed a lane. The phrase was not suspicious by itself, and yet, in memory, it wore the shape of a request he never liked. He asked Ross to read the phrase, and Ross said it. Hold 10 for a clear handoff if site control is missing. Nira glanced over with a look that said, do not get pulled into the river. Kellen nodded and kept the pace steady. He told Ross he could not speak to motives of old voices, and he could not name a colleague or contractor from memory. He said he could meet Ross with a sergeant who knew the policy, and they could file a supplemental report for records. Ross said he was tired of reports. Then he asked a new question. Was someone paid to push that hold in the storm? Kellen chose his words like glass marbles placed in a line. He said he had not seen evidence that proved a bribe. He said he had seen maintenance slips that missed dates in years with bad weather, and he had seen budgets cut twice. He said contracts sometimes shifted mid-season, and miscommunication could look like intent when viewed through grief and time. The cruiser staged in the dark lot of a bait shop, and the medic idled near a closed diner with frosted windows. The tower camera picked up 2 figures near the midspan, and the wind made their jackets move like wet flags. Kellen asked Ross if someone stood with him, and Ross said a cyclist had stopped and was holding a flashing light. He asked the cyclist for the phone, and the cyclist, shouting through wind, said he would hold the light where Ross stood. Kellen brought the cruiser onto the bridge, slow and quiet, then asked Ross to look over his right shoulder for headlights. He said he would keep talking while the car approached, and he would ask simple things about the person lost. Ross began to tell a short life. He said she had a laugh that came in bursts, and she liked folded maps. He said she had taken a night shift to help a younger sister, and she kept a lanyard with a faded tag. He said he watched her set cones before the storm hit, and he watched the curve where the sedan took the line. He said no one saw the driver afterward, and the report guessed water pushed evidence downriver where it turned to silt. He said the tape he found made his chest hurt because someone with a badge kept people where the wind was worst. Kellen said he heard the pain and he believed the sincerity. Then he asked Ross to step back from the rail 1 foot. He said small choices add minutes, and minutes stack into plans, and plans turn into days that someone can live through. The cruiser moved a foot at a time. The officer called in with a whisper to confirm eyes on the subjects. The wind kicked a tab of paper along the sidewalk, and the camera caught it hopping like a small animal in rain. Kellen asked Ross about the cracked case at the pier, and Ross said the fisherman who found it gave him the phone. He said he cleaned the mud with rice and heat, and the screen woke like a held breath and showed the saved audio. Kellen pictured a kitchen table with towels and a humming space heater and the stubborn work of saving a last voice. He told Ross that someone who would do that kind of work could also stand away from the edge and breathe tonight. Ross said people kept calling him crazy when he brought the phone around, and one clerk said to forget old storms. He said he would go if someone could promise the message would not vanish into a hole where things get lost. Kellen had a rule: never promise anything that depends on someone else. He made a different promise instead and wrote it down. He said he would take a copy himself, and he would log it as a citizen recording attached to a supplemental report. He said he would list the time and origin as provided, and he would initial the line and add a contact number. Ross went quiet, and the wind filled the line again, and the cruiser stopped a car length away with no flashers. The officer on the bridge said he saw a second person keeping distance, and the cyclist raised the light toward the railing. Kellen asked Ross if hearing a small true thing might help him come off the rail. Ross told him to say it plain. Kellen told him there was an internal review back then, and it did not find a bribe, but it did find a silence. He said a manager failed to file a conflict disclosure, and a vendor had a nephew on a crew scheduled for that week. He said the manager resigned before the report made the rounds, and the findings lived behind a line marked personnel matter. He said he had read that line with tired eyes and wished it said more, and that was the part he kept. He did not say the other part out loud, which was the line about a recommended reprimand for delayed notifications. He did not say the name of the dispatcher who missed a handoff while moving units during the storm shift. He did not say that the reprimand belonged to him for a calendar mistake that lost 2 minutes when the server lagged. He believed the 2 minutes had not caused the death, yet he carried them like a coin that burned his pocket. Ross stood very still. He asked why no one told the public that someone had been asked to resign quietly. Kellen said the county tells what it must by law, and the rest gathers dust and waits for someone to ask again. He said he understood that wait, then asked Ross to walk toward the cruiser while the cyclist kept the light behind. Ross said he wanted to hand the phone over himself and watch it enter the chain that could not be erased. Kellen told the officer to receive the device and document the handoff on camera, then he told the medic to stage closer. He kept talking to Ross about the quiet details of grief as the officer moved with hands open and calm shoulders. Ross stepped away from the rail, and the wind made the tension a little louder. Then the cruiser door clicked open. The officer took the phone and read the time on the screen for the camera, then thanked Ross and nodded at the cyclist. The medic stepped out with a blanket and stood near, and the cyclist said he would bike Ross home if that helped. Kellen set the line to a low hold and told Nira to mark the recording flagged for retention review and supervisory copy. He also wrote a note for himself to call records in the morning and ask for a manual pull from the deep archive. He would say the citizen copy exists and should be paired with any surviving log from the storm year for clarity. He would not say the rest, which was that he had been the one to misread the calendar view during a switch. He shifted to the closing questions that help people move. Any harm today? Any plan tonight? Any safe place to stay? Ross said he would stay with a friend who owed him a favor, and he would bring coffee to the cyclist as thanks. He said he would wait to hear if the recording matched the archive, and he would not visit the bridge again at night. Kellen said someone would call him within 3 business days, which felt safe to offer, and he wrote his own number anyway. He signed the log with a quick line and filed the incident under welfare resolved with evidence collected and no injury. The bridge camera caught the cruiser pulling away slow while the medic followed, and the cyclist lights faded toward the trail. Nira slid over a cup with fresh coffee and asked if he was okay, and he said yes, since people had stepped off safe. He picked up his notebook and drew a small square around the words he had written, which read, "Keep the silence clean." He drove home as rain dripped from the awning of the grocery, and the owner waved from a dark window with a thin smile. He unlocked the door and set his notebook on the table. Then he took the spare tape recorder from a drawer beside the sink. He spoke the date and the incident number and a short summary. Then he said 7 words that were just for the tape. He said the bridge call reminded him why small errors multiply and why a person can choose to carry them alone. In the morning, he brought the tape to the records clerk as a personal note to accompany the citizen copy for context. He did not include the part about his own reprimand, which lived on paper in a file that no one requested. He told the clerk that the caller needed confidence, that the system held memory, and the clerk said that part was done. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived to confirm the match, and the archived call contained the same phrase and timing. The letter said the review board would annotate the old memo to reflect the vendor relationship that had been missed. It also said the findings still pointed to weather and a panicked driver as primary causes rather than any delayed instruction. Kellen stood at the window and read the lines twice, then folded the letter and slid it under the notebook cover. He walked the long way to work and past the river that pretended to be quiet, while tugs moved lumber under the span. He thought about the part he had kept and judged whether it belonged in daylight or whether it still lived best in private. He decided to hold it until it served someone to hear it, which was not the same as hiding and felt closer to care. The stories. Why this abandoned cabin had alleged proof in drywall. The story kept circling a single point about an empty cabin and a word written behind drywall. People called it proof. They did not agree on what it proved, but they repeated the word until it sounded heavy. Renata Vale was 36 and worked as a county property assessor who handled delinquent parcels. She drove a faded sedan, kept a folder of index cards, and listened to dispatch traffic. On a late spring morning, she headed to a decommissioned fishing road where a tax sale cabin sat empty. Her goal was simple and boring, which was to document storm damage before the auction and verify the interior. The cabin stood near a shallow creek with boards turned gray and a porch sag bent toward the dirt. A rusted mailbox leaned near the gate, with paint scabbed off and a number grit filmed over. Renata took photos for the file. Then she checked the back door where a hasp hung, but the lock was missing. She logged the broken hardware as prior damage, then stepped inside while the floor pressed its complaint. The incident began as a sound that did not fit the room, and then a sight. A sheet of drywall in the front room had a patch that sounded hollow when tapped. The panel was bright white against tobacco walls, and 4 black screws sat too straight and clean. She noted a faint dust halo around the joint compound, which looked newer than the rest by many years. She started a routine sweep while recording voice notes to keep the chain of events tidy. The stove held a nest of brittle twigs, the fridge was gone, and a thin mattress lay folded. Renata kept moving and counted outlets, then paused at the patched panel again. Her notes said the sheet brand looked like a type common after 2010, not the 1980s era expected here. 2 neighbors drifted by while she worked and gave versions that agreed on mood, not detail. A ranch hand named Cleo Vargas recalled sirens and smoke from 1998 when a fire line whipped through. Cleo said a man who stayed here left in a hurry and never came back, and people held a fundraiser that winter. A grocer named Benito Lake remembered men in a county truck replacing a little window about 2012, though he admitted the year could be off. Renata took their names, then asked if anyone else checked the cabin in recent years. Cleo said an insurance adjuster came by after a windstorm, and Cleo believed the woman filed a report and sealed the door. Benito said a teenager broke in 2 summers later, then a deputy taped a notice and told kids to stay away. Renata wrote both recollections as witness statements with the usual caveats about memory. She returned to the panel and looked for a reason a patch would be that clean inside this neglected shell. The screws were square drive, which was common for newer fasteners, and the spacing suggested a single small repair. The joint compound had been sanded poorly and left a telltale crescent above the seam. She ran a small flashlight along the edge and found a hair-thin line that was not paint. Her job did not include prying open walls without cause, so she called her supervisor and explained the condition. He told her to capture more context and check permits, then hold off on any invasive step until the records search. Renata agreed and left the cabin to sit with her laptop in the car while the creek talked its small talk. The county database was a stubborn thing that offered results if you knew how to ask without being greedy. She entered the parcel number and found a series of tax liens followed by a default. The permit history showed 2 entries worth attention. First, a window replacement request filed 2011, then a drywall materials purchase noted by a grant program 2015. The second entry surprised her. since the grant was designed for weatherization, not interior repairs. She cross-checked the vendor list and saw a receipt from a hardware store 3 towns away. The purchase line item said half-sheet gypsum and screws with a date in early summer 2015. A note mentioned a volunteer crew and a case number from the sheriff office. Renata paused and rechecked the address to make sure she was not mixing properties. She downloaded everything, then called the sheriff records clerk and asked if the case number could be viewed. The clerk said the report was open public information because it involved property maintenance hours completed after a welfare check. The description said a deputy supervised a group that boarded a back window and patched a hole where a wood stove pipe had been. The deputy name was listed as J. Kravitz, with a badge number and a contact line. Renata called the number and reached a retired deputy, who answered his phone with a dry voice and correct dates. He remembered standing in that cabin while a volunteer placed a sheet over a hole, and he remembered the neighbors bringing lemonade. He also remembered boys laughing because someone had drawn a cartoon in dust above the refrigerator space. Renata thanked him and asked if any record included interior photos from that day that could be released. Kravitz said he took 3, which he felt comfortable sharing if the clerk confirmed the release path. The email reached her 10 minutes later, with 3 small images showing a too-clean patch, a bent stovepipe, and a blank wall. The timestamp read 2015, with an hour that matched late afternoon shadows. Renata zoomed in and saw the same screw pattern she had just seen in person. She returned inside with a copy of the email printed, which satisfied her need for a pre-image before touching anything. She recorded a video on her county phone, then gently ran a utility blade along the painted seam and loosened the small patch. The square drive screws turned with almost no resistance and dropped into her pocket. The board came free and showed the backside marked with pencil lines. There were 2 words in block print near the center, and a string of numbers that looked like miles or hours or both. The words read, "Tell Mara," then below them a date in words that matched late summer 2015. A thin arrow pointed toward the upper corner, where someone had tucked a sealed plastic bag with a micro SD card. Renata did not touch the bag, since she already had more than enough cause to stop and phone this in. She stepped back and spoke to her phone, as if it were a witness who needed comfort rather than patience. She said she had an evidentiary find, likely tied to a case report from 2015, and she described the board condition. She then called her supervisor and said she would hold position and request a deputy to document chain of custody. Her voice felt steady, which helped, and the creak still talked. The responding deputy arrived from the nearest substation and followed a familiar script at a deliberate pace. He photographed the panel, bagged the micro SD card, then requested a second unit to confirm signatures. He also asked Renata to repeat her steps for his body camera, which she did, and her voice stayed calm. He wrote "Tell Mara" in his notebook and underlined the date, then asked about any person by that name in the area. Cleo returned when he saw the cruiser and stood at the fence with a careful expression that suggested curiosity and worry. He said a woman named Mara used to work at the gas station near the highway, and she moved inland after the big fire. He believed she dated the man who once stayed at this cabin, whose name people rarely said anymore. Cleo said the man had a brother who fought with him over debt, which was rumor, and old rumor at that. Renata kept the witness statement straight and did not chase speculation, because theory makes friendly noise but muddies facts. The deputy asked dispatch to check archived calls around late summer 2015 for any mention of the station or the creek. Dispatch later replied that an incomplete emergency call pinged a tower near the old highway with a man's voice saying "wrong truck" before the line died. The call was never connected again, and the dispatch note listed a response that found nothing conclusive on the road. The investigators gathered all of this and began to lay a clean map of what the drywall might mean. The board was patched during a small volunteer day led by Deputy Kravitz, who remembered no note then because the drywall face was clean. The writing was on the backside, so whoever wrote "Tell Mara" likely wrote before installation or wrote during installation and then faced the board inward. The micro SD card fit the same logic, since it had to be tucked away before final screws. The sheriff tech opened the bag carefully and previewed the card on a laptop while Renata stood near the doorway. The card held a few small files, and one audio clip that was less than a minute long, with a man breathing hard. A voice said, "Mara." Then there was a scrape sound. Then the voice said, "Wrong truck? Check mile marker 12." Then silence. The text said the file metadata matched a late summer date, 2015, which matched the pencil note. The deputy asked Benito about mile 12, and Benito said a vanished reflector stood near a turnout everyone used for tire chains. He said the place was not on maps, but everyone knew it by a crooked pine and a faded mile stencil. A second unit drove there and found an old-cut bank with broken bottles and a rusted number plate choked by vines. That team then called for a grid walk and a metal sweep, which turned up a torn piece of a license frame. County records later produced an abandoned truck report filed by a salvage yard in early fall 2015. The report said a pickup had been moved by a private tow from a turnout before a storm and later sold for parts. The tow ticket listed a different mile marker by mistake, likely copied wrong by the driver, and the ticket names were hard to read. The salvage manager admitted their clerk sometimes took shortcuts with paperwork when storms crowded the yard. A detective interviewed the retired tow driver and asked for his memory of the pickup and its condition after the call. The driver said he remembered an empty truck with a broken rear glass and a tarp inside that smelled like gasoline. He said two men met him at the turnout and pointed to a path, and he signed a work order that he no longer had. He said he remembered a gold wedding band on a chain near the shifter, which he placed in a cup holder out of caution. The audio clip and the drywall note nudged the case from rumor to a timeline that had context and checkable waypoints. The incomplete call in 2015 used the words "wrong truck," which matched the audio and echoed through dispatch records. The mild repair day in 2015 created a perfect stage for a message that only a future visitor might find. The instruction "Tell Mara" suggested the writer knew a specific person would eventually hear about the cabin again. Renata learned that temp crews sometimes used whatever board they had in the truck, which could explain the face-inward mistake. A volunteer might have grabbed a sheet with a pencil note from the stack without thinking, then installed it with the note hidden. Another possibility was that the writer meant to hide the message, assuming a person who cared would eventually come prying. Both options fit the facts, and neither required creative leaps that could not be defended in a report. A second pass through the micro SD card revealed a photo of a dashboard with a gas station logo seen through the windshield. The date stamp matched the summer of 2015, and the triangle logo was the old brand used before a sale. Benito confirmed that the station repainted their canopy that autumn, which inadvertently confirmed the window of time. The detail felt small and almost petty, yet it anchored the sequence to a real week. The detective contacted the station owner, who produced archived night logs showing a purchase by a prepaid card at 11:42. A print from the receipt showed a pack of ice and a cheap burner phone that matched the model seen in the photo. The clerk on duty had long since moved, though a manager remembered a man who returned twice that night to borrow tape. He said he thought the man looked scraped up, and he remembered a truck with a blue fender and a white tailgate. A family member of the man who stayed at the cabin identified the voice on the audio as a high likelihood match. They provided an older voicemail that had similar breathing patterns when the man climbed hills for fun on weekends. The sheriff office sent both clips to a regional lab, which returned a cautious report that said the two voices were likely related. The lab kept the language safe, which made sense because certainty in audio work is often impossible. The drywall word itself caused arguments in corners where the story traveled faster than any memo could hope to move. People liked the part where the house was silent for years while a small message waited for a careful hand. Some said the word proof made sense because the voice was clearly him, and because the date matched the summer when he vanished. Others said proof is for courtrooms and journals, and this was only a lead until tested. Renata held her own view, which was that houses keep small time capsules without meaning to, and sometimes that matters. She had seen children's names carved into baseboards under carpet and grocery lists folded under a sink. She had also seen unsafe wiring stuffed into a cereal box and tucked inside a wall, and the box told its own story. People leave messages wherever they can, hoping someone decent will listen someday when it counts. The case shifted again when a trail crew found a piece of a phone shell near mile marker 11 during a separate survey. The shell matched the burner model bought that night, and nearby crews found a patch of old stain on the soil. A lab swab reported that the residue was fuel, which was consistent with the tow driver memory of gasoline smell in the truck. A chain of steps formed that linked the turnout, the audio clip, and the tow yard path. Mara was located by a social worker who knew 3 different last names for her from utility records. She met with investigators in a room that smelled like coffee, that had been reheated many times and left to think. She said she had not heard from him since that summer, and she cried in a way that was lightless but dry. When told about the drywall note, she put her head down and whispered that he tried to fix things and always left notes. She agreed to listen to the clip, then nodded and said the words were his when he felt cornered by debt and fear. She said wrong truck made sense because his brother drove a similar model and people mixed them up when angry. She said mile 12 meant the turnout where they used to watch road crews because he loved slow machines more than sleep. She asked if the word proof meant she could stop imagining him as a ghost in every passing pickup. The detective did not promise anything, which was the right call, and said the message mattered more than rumor. Mara said that was good enough for now and asked if she could visit the cabin to see the panel with her own eyes. Renata met her there with Cleo and Benito nearby, and they all stood quiet while the creek kept talking. Mara touched the pencil words like a fingertip prayer, then laughed once, small and sudden, because the handwriting was his. The county eventually sold the parcel to a quiet bidder who planned to reclaim lumber and leave the footprint for a garden. Before the sale, the sheriff office returned the panel to the property with a sealed sleeve that covered the message. A small plaque nailed to a beam recorded the date in words and the name of the deputy who first supervised repairs. It did not use the word proof, which felt right, because the wall was more than a verdict. Reporters asked Renata if she believed the drywall solved anything that mattered, and she answered with careful honesty and patience. She said it solved whether the cabin hid a message, and it offered a direction for facts to continue breathing. She said the board changed a rumor cloud into a line of checkable points that connected people who had waited years. She also said that what you call proof depends on the room you are standing in and the weight on your heart. The story kept circulating, and people kept walking that turnout and counting the faded stencils with respect and quiet. They looked for signs that someone had tried to speak in a tight corner and had chosen an odd messenger. They bent close to drywall, then stepped back and saw a small room that finally felt less like a tomb. They understood that time can hide a message, and sometimes the wall just needs a steady hand and a simple blade. When Renata thinks about the cabin now, she remembers the hush when the board came free and the pencil marks appeared. She remembers Cleo and Benito telling careful pieces and retired Deputy Kravitz recalling lemonade in a little paper cup. She remembers that proof is a rough word for a gentle thing, which is a voice asking someone to tell a person named Mara. She believes the house did what houses sometimes do, which is hold a note until the right listener finally arrives. The burning house on Ridge Road, Tennessee. Smoke showed over the folded hills west of Johnson City after sundown, a thin gray ribbon flattening under a cooling sky. Drivers slowed along Ridge Road and watched a single roofline lose its shape behind moving haze. Dispatch logs captured the first report at 1920, citing flames visible through trees near a narrow bend. The caller reportedly could not confirm people inside, only that the windows looked black and the yard was empty. Ethan Ward was 41, a volunteer firefighter from Jonesboro, driving home after a hardware errand when he saw the smoke. He slowed near the ridge crest and turned onto the gravel turnout by habit learned during brush seasons. His purpose that evening was practical and local, to check if anyone needed water or a ride toward the highway. Archive notes state he kept a wool blanket and a pry bar in his truck, a routine drawn from winter wrecks. He radioed county dispatch using a handheld set he carried off duty, requesting confirmation of the address that no one actually named. Mara Collins was 33, a home health nurse finishing a medication check near Telford, returning toward the city with an empty cooler. Her route crossed Ridge Road because traffic on the highway moved strangely that week after resurfacing work. She saw the same gray band, then a brighter pulse from a deeper pocket of trees cut into the slope. State records list her as licensed since 2011 with no disciplinary marks and multiple rural assignments. She later told deputies she stopped because the color shifted from brush to structure, a difference she recognized from farm incidents. Deputy Luis Benton was 37, a patrol deputy with Washington County, answering a fire assist call relayed across channels after neighboring units were engaged. His stated purpose was scene safety and initial perimeter control while county engines rerouted from a barn alarm. According to dispatch logs, he cleared a traffic complaint near Boone's Creek and set lights before the last ridge curve. His cruiser camera reportedly caught brief reflections on roadside mailboxes, then nothing but drifting particulate like fine dust. Some locals claimed the camera angle missed the driveway entirely, though investigators never confirmed a technical fault. The structure sat back from the road behind mature pines, a single-story rectangle with a shallow porch and a tin roof. County appraisal data listed it as built in the late 1970s with a detached shed and a shallow well. Records conflict on whether the electric service was active because one entry shows a delinquent account while another shows a recent payment. Ethan parked facing out and grabbed his pry bar, calling toward the porch that carried 2 chairs and a plastic crate. He reported hearing a low crack inside, not like a collapse, more like resinous boards reacting to heat across tight nails. Mara set her cooler on the driveway gravel and tried the front knob, which felt warm but not dangerous, then swung inward. She called out for anyone home and moved past the door line, stopping at a short hall choked with thin smoke. Ethan followed her with the blanket and a small flashlight, and they worked right first toward a room with stacked bins. County file from 2009 described prior code concerns about storage and blocked egress at this parcel, though no fines were listed. Investigators never confirmed whether those recommendations were addressed because 2 separate inspections show conflicting completion notes. Inside the bins were magazines and folded tarps, plus canning jars labeled with masking tape and dates that read last winter. The floor showed fresh sweeping lines, a detail noted in archived notes because the house otherwise felt unused. Ethan checked the window latch and found it painted shut, then cracked the frame with the pry bar to vent smoke. Mara pointed left toward a glow against a closed door. Not bright, just persistent, like heat collecting behind a thin barrier. They backed out to avoid pulling air through the hallway and feeding what had not yet broken free. Deputy Benton reached the turnout and cut his siren, then walked in with a flashlight and a disposable mask kept in his vest. He asked about occupants, utilities, and any hazards like cylinders or stored fuel, and Ethan gave short answers while scanning the tree line. State records showed a recent transfer of the property to a holding company with a Johnson City mailbox and no listed tenant. Some locals claimed a handyman stayed there between small jobs, sleeping on a cot and keeping tools in the shed. Investigators never confirmed his name, and records conflict on whether a temporary occupancy permit existed that season. Engines from Gray and Jonesboro turned onto Ridge Road within minutes, rerouted by radio after the barn alarm cleared false. The pump operator laid supply down the drive, while another crew stretched a line to the porch and checked the sill for flame. Ethan briefed the arriving lieutenant and stepped aside, then offered to pull a secondary line toward the shed if commanded. Dispatch logs show a note at 1931 about low water at the nearest hydrant, prompting a tender request from a neighboring district. The lieutenant reportedly decided on a quick interior search while the line charged, prioritizing rooms closest to the visible glow. Mara waited near the turnout and watched the tree line move against diffuse light, noticing a vehicle half hidden beyond the shed. She told Deputy Benton, and they walked over, finding an older sedan settled into grass with mildew on the windows and a flat tire. The plates returned to a woman from Unicoi, suspended for insurance issues, according to a quick check that night. Records conflict on whether the vehicle was recently driven because the engine bay felt cool, but the cabin held faint cigarette odor. Some locals claimed a similar car parked there on prior evenings, seen from the ridge during dog walks before dark. Inside the house, the quick search found no one in the main rooms, only a closed utility closet with a locked handle. The lieutenant ordered the door forced, and a cloud of hot vapor cleared into the hallway, carrying a stronger smell like adhesive. Investigators later wrote that a portable heater sat on a shelf near stacked cardboard close to a wall outlet with a cracked face. State records show a recall notice for similar units early that year, though purchase data for this property never surfaced. The pattern of heat reportedly suggested slow smolder transitioning toward open flame, not an immediate flash. The shed added a second puzzle because someone stored two blue drums, both labeled as waste oil with dates from spring. Deputy Benton photographed faint boot marks on the dusty floor, angled toward a pegboard with empty hooks and a missing hammer. Archived notes mention a recent report of tool thefts along rural roads, although the described method involved pried barn doors, not sheds. Mara stood back and pointed out a shallow trench leading from the shed corner toward a low spot near the pines. Investigators never confirmed whether it carried runoff from the drums, though soil samples reportedly showed hydrocarbons below threshold levels. Engines established flow, and crews cooled the hallway while ventilation fans pushed smoke through the cut window frames. The roof held, then flexed as trapped heat moved, releasing a rush that sounded like wind where no wind existed. Ethan helped pull debris into the yard and stacked it away from the porch, watching for char that could reignite in dry grass. The lieutenant asked for a final pass with the thermal camera, which showed a stubborn hot line behind the closet adjacent to old shelving. Records conflict on whether wiring upgrades ever reached this wall, because the permit file stops at rough inspection. As operations slowed, a neighbor walked up from the lower bend, a retired teacher who kept notes on local history for weekend talks. He told Deputy Benton the house once belonged to a family that left during the housing slump, then rented to short-term occupants. He said a man with a gray cap visited that week, carrying a tool bag and a stack of envelopes clipped together. Some locals claimed the envelopes were rent notices, while others said they looked like county flyers about brush cleanup. Investigators never confirmed either, and no envelopes were found in the debris or the nearby ditch. A second neighbor recalled hearing a truck on Ridge Road before dusk, stopping briefly near the turnout where Ethan later parked. Dispatch logs include a time-stamped note about a call from another ridge, mentioning a revving sound and a quick departure downhill. State records contain no traffic stop matching that description because cruisers were occupied with the barn alarm and a separate welfare check. Archived notes suggest similar patterns at vacant structures during cold snaps, when heaters appear without paperwork and vanish after damage. The pattern reportedly motivated patrol sweeps that winter, although budget sheets show reduced overtime during that quarter. When investigators sifted the hallway, they found two door keys fused together near the closet, an odd pairing for such a narrow space. Ethan told them he had not seen a ring by the entry table, only scattered coins and a cracked picture frame. Mara remembered a faint outline on the wall where something once hung. Possibly a calendar, possibly a routing sheet for maintenance visits. Records conflict on whether a property manager ever posted documents inside rentals because policies changed when ownership moved to holding companies. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the fused keys, though measurements matched standard blanks used across the county. The final report described the cause as undetermined, with contributing factors tied to portable heat and compromised outlets along the interior wall. It noted the absence of occupants and the lack of personal clothing in closets, plus stacked bins suggesting storage rather than residence. State records later updated the parcel as unsafe, recommending fencing and watch patrols during evenings when traffic thins across the ridge. Some locals claimed they saw a single light in the shed days after the fire, a small square glow that disappeared when trucks approached. Investigators never confirmed that detail, and camera coverage shows only drifting night insects reflecting a weak beam. Months later, the sedan was towed, the shed locks replaced, and the house boarded with standard plywood stencil marks facing the road. Archived notes remark that Ethan returned twice on his own time to check for trespass, finding only raccoon prints and windblown ash. Mara crossed the ridge less often after shifting routes, but she kept a map pin on her phone to remember the turnoff. Records conflict on whether the holding company renewed insurance because one policy number shows a cancellation while another appears active with missing dates. The parcel remains listed as improved rural, awaiting decisions that reportedly stalled during meetings held without posted minutes. What happened inside the hour before smoke rose over the hills remains a narrowing field of possibilities tested against stubborn gaps. The heater could have crept against cardboard, or an unseen splice could have heated behind shelving where old nails pierced brittle insulation. A visitor might have plugged something into the cracked outlet, then left, believing the glow would settle as temperatures dropped. Investigators never confirmed a timeline inside that closet, and the county file from 2009 ends before the relevant changes. Some locals claimed the house never wanted people, yet the official record only shows heat, fuel, oxygen, and a door that stuck. The stories. This motel room voicemail raised a separate question. On a rainy Tuesday, near the end of tourist season, a motel room voicemail carried a question that did not belong. It turned a tired end of shift into something careful and strange, and it started with a blinking red light. Dorian Pike worked nights at the Northway Motor Inn, 37, a patient manager who fixed things others ignored. The place sat off a service road past a truck stop, with a diner and a feed store as neighbors. He started that shift with a simple goal: balance the register, finish the towel count, and coax the ice machine back aloft. The storm slowed arrivals, and the security monitor rolled its quiet grayscale loop of the parking lot. Housekeeping left a note about room 12, the kind of note other managers forgot to read. The bed looked unused after checkout, the television glowed at low volume, and the phone message light blinked at eye level. He carried a spare key, pushed the door open, and smelled damp carpet and motel soap. Nothing surprising. The news channel murmured through commercials, a static map of counties he could name without trying. On the nightstand sat a spiral notebook half full of block letters, a takeout cup, and a key card with the room number worn. He pressed the voicemail button with his knuckle because the button shocked him once in summer. A male voice filled the room with a flat question that stopped his hand, like a bad chord laid wrong. The voice asked, "Did you move the smoke detector again?" And then silence, followed by the system tone and cutoff. He replayed it twice, and the question felt like a pebble in a shoe, something to be dealt with. Smoke detectors did not get moved by guests without reason, and nothing about the room said routine or careless. Dorian checked the detector on the ceiling, a cheap white unit that did not match the others on the hall. The motel used one supplier for replacements, and this casing lacked their sticker and the penciled date inside. He stood on the chair, unscrewed the ring, and found fresh scuffs around the mounting plate as if removed recently. The unit felt heavier than a sensor should, and the test light never flashed, which meant battery or guts. He set it down on the table, and the vent above the television rattled just a little with the wind. He turned off the television, let the room get quiet, and heard faint tapping through the vent to the next room. The motel had a habit of telling its secrets through noise, and he had learned that language over years. He stepped into the hall and knocked on room 14, where a regular was finishing a long week of field work. Quinn Hauer was 29, a cell tower contractor with a tool bag and a precise way of speaking. Quinn opened the door and said, "Heard the tapping, thought it was heat. But it kept hitching, like somebody counting seconds." Dorian nodded, thanked him, and walked back to room 12 with the detector in his hands and a growing list. He checked the guest ledger for that room, found the name Shane Bennett written in rough ballpoint yesterday afternoon. The rate was paid in cash with a $20 deposit, and there was a note about requesting a high floor. The motel only had 2 floors, which made the request sound like reflex, not preference, and it bothered him. He logged into the creaking PBX console behind the office door, a beige box that stored more than it admitted. The system kept message times, not caller numbers, but it stored archived call counts and extension traces within limits. The voice message timestamp put the call at 4:21 this morning when he had been home asleep. The system marked it as external to the motel, but without a number, which meant blocked or masked through a service. He played the message once more through the PBX speaker, and this time he listened past the words to the air. There was a faint horn in the background, not a car, something long and low that cut through the compressor hum. The town had 2 train crossings, one near the elevator factory, the other near the river access by Mill Road. The factory horn sounded higher by habit, and the river crossing had a long, lonely tone that travelers remembered. He wrote train horn in the notebook, then dialed the non-emergency line and described a suspicious device in room 12. He kept the language careful and factual, and the dispatcher asked for his name, then said a unit would respond. Housekeeper Irina Kowalski stopped by the desk to clock out. 58. Quiet. A 10-year veteran of the place. She saw the detector on the counter and said she smelled glue when she changed linens, thought it came from that. He asked if she saw anyone in room 12 after checkout, and she said only a woman with a baseball cap. She had a service bucket and a ring of keys, and Irina thought she was with maintenance, since she walked like staff. There were 2 maintenance guys by payroll. Neither wore caps, and neither worked Tuesdays after 3 in the afternoon. He wrote this down, then checked a clipboard of deliveries, and found a package signed by someone not on schedule. The box came yesterday morning for guest Bennett, signed by a scrawl that did not match any front desk initials. It contained a replacement smoke detector per the note, which made the blinking voicemail question feel heavier. Dorian carried the box to the office, found bubble wrap inside, plus a cutout where the detector had Saturday, tape residue stuck in a neat circle on the cardboard, and a tiny zip bag with nothing in it fell from a seam. He looked at the detector again under the desk lamp and noticed a slot behind the grill where no slot should be. He slid a paperclip in and clicked against something spring-loaded, which offered and then refused to move. The responding officer arrived while the storm thickened, and his boots left dark prints that dried like islands. He introduced himself as Deputy Holloway, 40, calm voice, and asked for the room key, the voicemail, and the timeline. Dorian played the message for him on the office speaker, and the train horn showed itself again under the words. Holloway wrote it down, then called in the serial from the detector, and the brand came back to a discount dropshipper. They walked to room 12 with the box, and Holloway took photos with a little camera that hated the low light. He gave Dorian latex gloves from his pocket, then pointed at the slot and said he would rather not break it. Dorian tried the paperclip again, this time with a little twist and a push, and the plate popped forward an inch. Inside sat something that was not a sensor, a puck with a lens barely visible and a microcard at the edge. He did not pull it, he did not touch the lens, he just looked at Holloway, whose jaw tightened for 3 beats. The deputy called dispatch and asked for a detective on call, then told Dorian to step back and breathe. The motel office had a rule about honesty with guests, which worked until honesty touched evidence and risk. Dorian printed a sign for the counter that said service delay for weather, and the storm covered that small necessary lie. Holloway kept the room closed and waited for the detective, while Dorian returned to the PBX to audit messages. He printed the log for the last 2 days, circled 3 external calls to room 12, all between midnight and 5. He played the first 2 messages carefully, and they were empty hang-ups, with the same horn underneath and 1 faint laugh. He resisted all guessing and wrote horn consistent in a margin, then underlined the time of the 3rd message. He checked the security drive for the hallway, and the camera caught only the tops of heads and a bit of shoulder. At 3:12 this morning, a person in a cap walked by with a tote, turned left, and vanished from frame. Dorian paused on the frame and noted the sleeve stripes, a set of 2 pale bands near the wrist. Irina had seen a cap on the woman, and the frame showed hair tucked tight, with a loose strand at the neck. Detective Renner arrived with a kit and a steady patience, a mid-40s investigator who disliked motel carpet. She listened to the voicemail twice, glanced at the detector, and asked Dorian to walk her through intake and checkout. He explained the cash payment, the request for a high floor, and the delivery for a detector that should not change. She wrote as he talked, asked about prior incidents, and he mentioned 2 privacy complaints from summer travelers. Those complaints stopped after he replaced room units from the same run, and he had kept the receipts and dates. He pulled copies from the accordion file, and she photographed them, then asked whether any rooms shared vent passageways. He described the vent layout, straight shaft between rooms in pairs, with thin walls that carried sound farther than comfort. Renner nodded and walked to room 14, asked Quinn to step into the hall, and confirmed the tapping report. Quinn described the pace like a metronome, not random, 2 taps, then a short pause, repeated until the thunder started. Renner wrote it down, and Dorian drew the pattern in a margin, then realized something he had missed earlier today. The television in room 12 was on the news channel at low volume, which travelers often used as a decoy. Some people left it on to pretend someone was inside, which meant the room might have been staged after a quick exit. Renner opened the detector with gloves and eased the card into a tiny envelope, then sealed it with her initials. She asked Dorian about any computers to view file sizes, not contents, just metadata, and he shook his head no. She used her agency laptop to check what the card held, and the screen reflected in the blank television glass. The card contained multiple files named by date and time, a standard naming scheme, which meant scheduled recording, not motion. Renner closed the laptop without opening anything and said the specifics would wait for a warrant and a lab. She asked for the guest profile again, and he gave the same summary, plus the note about the signed delivery receipt. Dorian returned to the box and saw a faint watermark in the cardboard that read Consolidated Freight with a Town. The town sat by the river tracks where the Longhorn lived, and the company ran a warehouse near the ramp. He wrote the company down as an external lead, then called the number printed on their listing from a web search. He asked, in his perfectly polite desk voice, whether any packages left for a motel guest yesterday morning. The dispatcher said they handed one small box to a contractor with a name that matched no employee on file. It was recorded on their log with a time, and the signature block contained the same scrawl as his earlier photocopy. Renner thanked him for the call, took the information, and said she would handle any next contact with that company. She requested the spiral notebook from the room, and Dorian placed it in a bag, pages open to the block letters. The letters contained hotel names and highway exits, a list of routes that matched a traveler who did not like surprises. Some lines included cable channel numbers, others included lamplight wattages, and one included the word ceiling with a star. Dorian remembered a complaint from 2 weeks ago from a different guest about a beeping detector in room 5. He checked his maintenance log and found he replaced that unit on a Wednesday after a short argument about deposit charges. He fetched the old detector from the storage shelf, where broken things went to wait for disposal, and compared its weight. The broken one felt light as expected, and the one from room 12 felt like two of them taped together. He unscrewed the broken one and found no strange slot, only dust, a dead battery, and the usual brittle plastic. Renner watched from the doorway and nodded, then answered her phone, and her yes sounded like cautious confirmation. The non-emergency dispatcher had pulled 2 archived calls from the spring that sounded similar, not identical, but close. Each referenced a detector, each asked whether it had been moved, and both targeted rooms paid in cash and late. Renner asked Dorian to print any copies of photo identification kept on file, and he showed the log policy instead. The inn did not photocopy identification unless the card used for payment had a name mismatch or a mismatch with booking. He looked at the lobby camera track for the check-in, and the frame showed a jacket with sleeve stripes again. The face never lifted to the lens, and the cap brim hid most features, but the build matched the hallway pass. The storm eased into a steady pour, the kind that makes a street look polished, and the motel sign clicked. Renner gave Dorian a statement form and asked him to write what he did and why, as precisely as possible. He wrote that a voicemail raised a secret question about a smoke detector, which is not a thing guests ask. He wrote that the detector was wrong for the room, that its weight felt off, and that a slot existed. He wrote that a horn in the background suggested a location near the river tracks and that a freight watermark helped. He wrote that a woman with a cap carried a tote down the hall, and that tapping came through the vent. Renner finished securing the room and returned the hallway to regular use, with a note to keep room 12 closed. She told Dorian that similar devices had surfaced in short-term rentals nearby, and that his details tightened the pattern. She thanked Irena and Quinn for their help, then left with Holloway and the sealed card and the odd detector. Dorian stood in the quiet office and watched the parking lot glow under a light that had survived 4 storms this month. He made copies of everything for the file, then sat with the register and finished what he started hours earlier. The ice machine hummed to life with a stubborn cough, which felt like a small mercy after the nervous work. 2 days later, Renner called to say the voicemail mattered more than he realized because of the horn and the freight. The freight record placed a contractor truck at the warehouse near the river during the call window before dawn. She said the case would likely spread across jurisdictions and that his notes already sat in a shared folder. She did not share more, and he did not ask, because he understood the slow way these things must move to hold. Quinn checked out with a handshake and a tight thanks, and Irina started a new hallway routine that included ceiling checks. The motel added a policy line about devices, not because it fixed the world, but because it set a tone. On the next Tuesday, the phone light blinked again in a different room, and Dorian felt a breath catch. He pressed the button and heard a normal message from a family asking for extra towels, and he laughed because relief deserves sound. He still thought about the spiral notebook, about the starred word ceiling, and about the staged television glow. He thought about the simple question that did not belong, and how such questions sometimes open doors no one planned. Travelers came and went, the storm season thinned, and the parking lot felt like a stage that forgot its lines. Dorian kept the office tidy and the camera lenses clean, and he learned to trust the hairs rising on his arm.